Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate that. I think a very important conversation to be had here. I'm Barb Perry. I'm the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism and the UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies here at Ontario Tech, and really glad you were able to join us today. I know it's a busy time of year, so glad you were able to find the time to be with us today. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that this land on which Ontario Tech operates for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. While we're grateful to be working on these lands, we as settlers are by definition an uninvited presence, legitimated only through force and coercion applied by colonial forces of the past and present. Although we're all governed by William's treaties, we recognize the imbalance of power inherent in these treaties. Thus, we're committed to building partnerships that frame our presence by substantially changing the foundation of our relationship in accordance with the desires of First Nation people. Really happy to have with us today Jasmin Zine, who is a professor of sociology and religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier. Her recent book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation with McGill Queens Press, explores the experiences of the millennial generation of Canadian Muslim youth who came of age during the global war on terror in times of heightened anti-Muslim racism. She served as a consultant on combating Islamophobia for the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that is the ODIHR office at OSCE. She's a sought-after media commentator and has given numerous invited talks and keynotes internationally. Dr. Zine is co-founder of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, IISRA. She's also the author of a major report on the Canadian Islamophobia industry that examines the networks of hate and bigotry that purvey and monetize Islamophobia, which is what brings her here today. And I think that this is such an important report. We often, as in many contexts, are very complacent in Canada, and we know there's an Islamophobia industry in the UK. We know there's one in the US. We know there's a global industry, but we seem to think somehow it's not a part of our legacy and our culture. But yeah, Jasmin is here to tell us different. So as I say, I think this is such an important conversation, and thank you for the work that you've done and continue to do, and thank you for sharing that with us today. So the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this report and to have some very appreciative for the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism to provide this forum, and to Barbara, who's been a colleague and someone who's doing some very important work that is aligned with what I have been trying to do as well. So really appreciate that collegiality and scholarship there as well. So welcome and thanks. So yes, let's hope the technology cooperates with us. And if you can't see me, hopefully you can see the screen and hear me. Okay, one moment. So the work that I've been doing in the last few years is this study, the Canadian Islamophobia Industry, Mapping Islamophobia's Ecosystem in the Great White North. And this study's identified how Islamophobia in Canada is organized, orchestrated, networked, and monetized. Now, over the last 10 years, studies in the US have examined the Islamophobia industry and how it operates south of the border. And there have been influential studies like Fear Inked, Hijacked by Hate, and Nathan Lean's book on the Islamophobia industry, which were among the first to identify the coordinated and monetized nature of Islamophobia and identified some of the key players behind it. So what I'm going to share with you today are findings from a 4-year study that culminated in a 250-page report that maps Islamophobia's ecosystem in Canada. So what's significant here and what distinguishes Islamophobia from other forms of oppression is the industry behind it that is purveying anti-Muslim hate. So I look at the Islamophobia industry as being comprised of media outlets, far-right white nationalist groups, Islamophobia influencers and ideologues, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Muslim dissidents, think tanks, security experts, and the donors who fund their campaigns. So these individuals, groups, and institutions comprise a network that supports and engages in activities that demonize and marginalize Islam and Muslims in Canada. So just to review some of the objectives of this study, they were to map the political, ideological, institutional, and economic networks that foment Islamophobic fear and moral panic in Canada, to examine the strategies employed by Islamophobia agents and highlight the ties among the players within the Islamophobia industry, and create profiles of key public figures, media outlets, organizations who produce and distribute Islamophobic ideologies and propaganda, and to identify the dominant Islamophobic discourses that circulate through these networks. And to do this, we used a social network analysis, which was performed to examine relevant media articles, websites, public commentary, and videos from Islamophobia influencers and ideologues, various organizations, media outlets, and other anti-Muslim special interest groups that promote Islamophobic campaigns. So social network analysis involves a distinct set of methods used for mapping, measuring, and analyzing the social relationship between people, between groups and organizations, in order to identify the communication flows, resource exchanges, and sort of mutual social support that they offer. And so this approach was useful for mapping the actors within the network and the connections and communication flows between them as part of this ecosystem within which these Islamophobic subcultures reside. And, I think to point out the saliency and importance of embarking on this project, we only need to look at the way that Islamophobia has had very deadly consequences and reached deadly proportions in this country. So the images you're seeing on the screen are of the funeral or janaza of 6 Muslim men who were killed on January 29th, 2017 in a mosque in Quebec City. And then on the right-hand side, memorial for a Pakistani Canadian Muslim family that was mowed down intentionally while taking an evening walk, and 4 members representing 3 generations of that family were killed on June 6, 2021. Both of these attacks occurred at the hands of white nationalists. So this report is dedicated to the victims of these tragedies and their families, who we held in our hearts and minds as we worked on this project. And so what's significant again about Islamophobia is that it is organized. And so if we, look at the players within the Islamophobia industry, there are some key individuals and groups that we can point to, such as, as I've mentioned, the media outlets and different individuals and groups that comprise this network, where we start to see otherwise diverse individuals and groups coming together as the result of shared political and ideological mandates that involve the demonization and vilification of Islam and Muslims. And they often work in concert to foment controversies and spread Islamophobic narratives and conspiracy theories. So I'm just going to take you through this diagram of some of the key players. So in the center, we have far-right media and Islamophobia influencers. So in Canada, Rebel News and other far-right outlets circulate racist and Islamophobic narratives that are dog whistling to militant anti-Muslim groups. Islamophobia influencers, and we can point to people like Faith Goldie, Lauren Southern, for example, and others, contribute to far-right media forums, and they use their social media platforms to professionalize and monetize their propaganda and bigotry. So Islamophobic paranoia is widely circulated through the Canadian far-right media outlets. And newer outlets are also emerging that have a similar political bent and purpose, and that expand the far-right echo chamber and add to the propagation of Islamophobic ideologies and anti-Muslim conspiracy theories. We also have identified some other groups that are part of this broader constellation. For example, what we call the foot soldiers of the Islamophobia industry. We're referring to white nationalists, far-right white nationalists and neo-Nazi groups and the agitators behind them, who are active in promoting anti-Muslim hate and online, as well as through public protests and demonstrations. Barbara Perry's work has alerted us to the fact that across Canada, there's approximately 300 white nationalist groups of varying sizes and influence. And among those groups, promoting Islamophobia is a core mandate for some of the Canada-based groups, such as Pegida, Soldiers of Odin, Canadian Infidels, the Northern Guard, ID Canada, Proud Boys, Cultural Action Party, Yellow Vest, Canadian Nationalist Party, Blood and Honor, Combat 18, Students for Western Civilization, 3 Percenters, Rise Canada, the World Coalition Against Islam, and in Quebec, La Mute. So those are the groups that we provided profiles on within this report, and they play a key role within this broader network. The other group that, while these are the foot soldiers, we kind of characterized as the soft power behind the Islamophobia industry. And, soft power groups leverage influence by promoting anti-Muslim campaigns to achieve specific political, ideological, and religious goals that drive Islamophobic subcultures. And they do this under the guise often of promoting democracy, human rights, free speech, and Judeo-Christian values, ideals to which they deem Islam and Muslims as being antithetical and incompatible. Excuse me. So the soft power groups engage in coercive tactics like bullying, harassment, and intimidation to silence those who oppose them. By and large, the soft power brokers are what we characterized as pro-Israel fringe right groups. These ideological purveyors espouse conspiracy theories about Muslim organizations and charities serving as a Trojan horse for Islamist groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, whom they see as having an agenda of global domination. So, for example, they see Muslims as a Trojan horse within Canada or a fifth column, who have the nefarious intent of taking over Canadian policies and institutions and ultimately installing Sharia law. These groups were also very much behind opposing Motion 103, which was a non-binding motion that was tabled in the aftermath of the Quebec mosque shooting by Liberal MP Iqra Khalid. And it really just outlined an intent to examine Islamophobia, to study it along with systemic racism and religious discrimination in Canada, with a view to addressing, these forms of discrimination in Canada. However, a number of the groups within the soft power sector came together, formed, various pop-up groups to try and undermine it. So that was part of the role that these particular groups play. Another key group of players in the Islamophobia industry are the Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims, who I refer to as the native informers within the report. And it might seem counterintuitive to folks to think that there are actually Muslim groups or individuals that would be aligned with an Islamophobia industry. But in fact, the Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims play a role of being authoritative interlocutors, creating and validating Islamophobic narratives and conspiracy theories. And in that sense, they provide the political cover for Islamophobic campaigns. And that is because, these rather unlikely Islamophobic influencers and ideologues play this sort of insider role as native informers, and therefore have that opportunity to validate pejorative stereotypes about Islam. And so they play a major part in fomenting and legitimating anti-Muslim tropes. Another sector of the Islamophobia industry are the think tanks and their designated security experts. These groups and individuals create a kind of cult of expertise to promote Islamophobic conspiracy theories that brand Muslims as potential radicals and threats to national security. The think tanks and their designated security experts propagate Islamophobic rhetoric under the guise of national security and protecting Canada from dangerous Muslim foreigners, as well as homegrown radicals. And so these stereotypes allow for Muslims to be singled out for undue scrutiny, as well as racial and religious profiling. So in this way, we see Islamophobia fortifying the security industrial complex and legitimating policies that construct Muslims as potential jihadists who require state surveillance and monitoring. And then some of the other groups that are facets of the Islamophobia industry that are part of the broader ecosystem include political figures and influencers. The Islamophobia industry is strengthened and enabled by politicians who also authorize Islamophobic narratives and policies that are promoting Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism as part of this broader ecosystem. And that begins to prime the ground for Islamophobic racism to take root and spread. And that's also referenced in policies in Quebec, like Bill 21, for example, regulating religious attire in the public sphere that tends to focus on Muslim expressions of Muslimness that Muslim women in particular might be wearing, whether headscarves or face veils and so on. So there's a broader sort of ecosystem, which I do talk about in the report, that allows for Islamophobia to germinate and to gain traction. I should point out as well that some of the categories that we've included in this report on Canada are more expansive than those that have been previously identified in studies of the Islamophobia industry in the United States. So for example, far-right white nationalist groups or the foot soldiers and the industry of security experts are captured here, but they didn't figure prominently in American studies. Though I would suspect undoubtedly they play a similar role south of the border. And so as the ties between different sectors of the Islamophobia industry grow, the interactive role of these groups becomes more evident. And so, as we were applying this sort of social network theory to look at how these groups were connected in a variety of ways, we saw a number of strategies that actually serve to amplify and extend the reach of the Islamophobic messaging of these groups. So some of the strategies they used were platforming each other, co-platforming, where cooperative and reciprocal ties. You see individuals move between Islamophobia interest groups and provide and share with one another public platforms for their anti-Muslim rhetoric. And through that, they are echoing and amplifying that messaging. And so the circulation and affirmation of shared Islamic phobic tropes, discourses, and conspiracy theories becomes facilitated by those common platforms. The reiteration and piggybacking of those ideas by different sectors of the Islamophobia industry lend them credence and further their normalization as common sense notions. And then, of course, as I mentioned, this role of legitimating and validating, and in particular, a lot of the, Muslim dissidents will play that role. And it happens through the widespread circulation of ideas in the Islamophobia playlist, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. And that sort of archive or repository of all of these negative Islamophobic tropes and discourses begins to garner more legitimacy when it's leveraged simultaneously by different special interest groups. And so the Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims provide that validation for anti-Muslim view because, well, they're insiders, they must really know what's going on. So their views bring with them, that sense of authority by virtue and the presumed authority of their insider status. There's also enabling, and enabling involves two activities primarily. Financial support for anti-Muslim campaigns, events, speakers, or those behind those activities, and direct action. So working together, actively participating in rallies, demonstrations, and events held by other Islamophobic interest groups, for example, acting as a security detail. So those are some of the kinds of connections that we documented between the different groups, which, is how they work as a networked system. So just by way of illustration, to show some of the kind of strange, maybe unholy bedfellows that emerge out of these Islamophobia groups, here's some photos that together show a composite of how some of the groups come together. So this was a series of these, the photograph here on the left and on the right were part of a rally, a pop-up rally by, here you can see Sandra Solomon, who is an ex-Muslim. And she often has very kind of theatrical events that she does, goes around ripping out pages of the Quran and such things. Here it was a rally, sort of a rally to counter a demonstration, a pro-Palestinian demonstration. So she was there along with the Jewish Defense League, who we see in the back. And we also here have an image of the Jewish Defense League arm in arm with the white nationalist group, the Soldiers of Odin, who were security for this event and are often supporting Sandra Solomon's event. So we see common purpose among these otherwise disparate groups. This group, WCI, World Council Against Islam, was actually one of the organizers of this event, and they're often connected with this character below, Ron Banerjee from Rise Canada, who is a Hindutva nationalist and very active anti-Muslim influencer and activist. And so you can see here just the constellation of these groups, their connections together, and how they have platformed each other, come together through rallies and coordinate events together, gives you some sense of the coordination of the Islamophobia industry and how they are active in actually orchestrating particular controversies. One of the case studies I provide in the report is around Ayman al-Kasrawi. Here you can see some signs that were brought to this particular rally. And he was a contract faculty engineering, PhD engineering student at Ryerson University, now TMU, who was also an imam at the Toronto Masjid. And eventually, a video came to light of him offering a supplication after a Friday prayer. This was during a time where it was a lot of conflict around Al-Aqsa Mosque in the conflict, was something he was addressing because, soldiers were going into the mosque. There was fear of desecration and so on. And so he was addressing this in an after prayer supplication. What happened was, though, that a video circulated alleging that he had said that, we must purify Al-Aqsa Mosque from the filth of the Jews, which is a terrible and anti-Semitic statement. However, as it turned out, that video ended up being revealed as a doctored video that had been spliced together with, it was a much longer, prayer that he had said, and parts of it had been spliced together and mistranslated. It was also found that a former Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson was responsible for that. And so that nonetheless led to his termination of his employment at TMU. So that's one of the controversies, and I do provide a more detailed overview of it in the report, which shows the ways that the industry came together around this one controversy, and this rally shows how his case was also invoked among these groups. So what is also common to the shared sort of repository of Islamophobic propaganda among these groups is very significant. It's what I call Islamophobia's playlist. And so there's a number of, tropes and narratives, discourses, conspiracy theories that we identified circulating in Canada. They're not confined to Canada, they exist globally. But I wanted to just share with you a few of, some of the Canadian, tropes and conspiracies. So you often have this idea of Muslims as invaders. We see this a lot in Europe as well, who are coming in and, have this intent to mount a kind of civilizational jihad and change the foundation of Canadian society. And therefore they're seen, as a kind of Trojan horse that will unleash, Muslim radicals and install a fifth column that will eventually take over Canadian institutions. There's the conspiracy theory that already Muslim organizations and charities are part of this nefarious network and are being, actually just puppets for groups like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. And that, Muslims are actually very deceptive, this notion of taqiyya, so that, they are here under very false pretenses. You can see this kind of like image over here of the fox in the chicken coop. That's very much the idea of Muslims as wolves in sheep's clothing. So they are not to be trusted, and that they are being very much directed to conceal their actual intent, and that there are some Quranic, verses that are guiding Muslims to, be deceptive and, hide their true, intent to, take over Canada. And what that does is also weaponize the Quran, taking verses very much out of context, dehistoricize, decontextualize, and using them to promote a particular kind of conspiracy theory. So that is another sort of discursive tactic in the Islamophobic arsenal that these groups have. And so that's the notion of taqiyya, or deception. You also have, where groups are looking back into historical conflicts with the Muslim world to activate their contemporary, interventions and Islamophobic crusades, if you will, by actually using the crusades as one of the rallying cries. You can see over here in this image, Faith Goldie and Lauren Southern, two prominent Islamophobia influencers who both were sort of birthed through rebel media, wearing sweatshirts that say Dus Volt, which is was the rallying cry of one of the crusades. And so they wear this as a reminder that they are, continually fighting this crusade against the Muslim world. And we also see this notion here of demographic replacement, or a demographic jihad. And you can see the images here are trying to show that, particularly this one here, where, Muslim women are seen as kind of incubators for, future Muslim generations and populations that will become radicals and jihadists and will eventually, begin to take over, both demographically by virtue of, the way that they are reproducing at a higher rate than white populations, but also through a kind of civilizational jihad that they will also enact as part of that, right? So these are just a few of the ways in which Muslims are playing into sort of biopolitical demographic fears, all sorts of other existential angst, and are, these various conspiracy theories have come together, as a kind of playlist of which Islamophobia actors are drawing upon to promote the propaganda, the fear and moral panic of around Muslims. So looking at one of those tropes, the Muslim invaders, and we saw on the previous slide how Faith Goldie was, had a backdrop of the Muslim invaders. This is a very pervasive trope, not only in Canada, but globally. And this is a very distressing image. If you see down here on the bottom, this was the family that was attacked on June 6, 2021. at the hands of a white nationalist driving a truck that mowed into them as they were taking a walk in the evening. And they here are referred to as dead invaders. And the young boy was about 9 years old, who was also part of the attack. He did survive, but lost 3 generations of his family in that attack and was injured, was in hospital, and he's referred to here as an injured invader. So we see this is from Terragram. And this is a site where, you know, after someone commits a deadly act of violence against Muslims, they become sainted. And so this is showing the perpetrator of that attack and referring to him as a saint. And so this is the kind of an example of some of the propaganda that is also put out to further radicalize some of these groups and, you know, to further entrench this anti-Muslim animus among the subculture of white nationalist groups and their shared anti-Muslim, you know, rhetoric and campaigns. We can also see some of that represented here on the gun. This is an analysis of the gun that was used in the Christchurch, New Zealand attacks in 2019. And we see, for example, the name of the attacker in the Alexander Bissonnette, who was responsible for the Quebec mosque shooting, and his name being, you know, added to that gun. And we also see other kinds of representations, historical, of people who have historical figures who fought against Muslims, and you know, the significance of 1683 and the siege of Vienna by the Ottoman Empire, also a historical touchstone that is drawn upon by many of these groups to kind of animate their contemporary anti-Muslim campaigns. So some of the Canadian players, you know, the report highlights a number of players by looking at, you know, creating profiles about them. And one of the figures we focus on here is Christine Douglas Williams. She's associated with a number of groups, which I'll show you in a moment. And she was also actually on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Around the time where she was invited to Iceland, along with Robert Spencer, who is a key player in the Islamophobia industry in the United States, and they were invited by a white nationalist group called ODHIR. And when she was in Iceland, she brought a warning to Icelanders about the Muslim presence in their country. And here's a quote from her. She said, "Islamic supremacists will smile at you, invite you to their gatherings, make you feel loved and welcome. But they do it to deceive you and to overtake you, your land and your freedoms. Jihadists are coming for you, no matter how much other Muslims may smile at you and appear friendly." So this is a example of the taqiyya narrative, the idea that Muslims are wolves in sheep's clothing, don't trust them, don't believe them. They have a smiling facade, but behind that is a sort of deadly and nefarious intent. And so again, this you know, speech that she gave in Iceland at the invitation of a white nationalist group was undertaken while she was still part of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So just to give you a sense of one of the players in the Islamophobia industry, Christine Douglas Williams, and the kinds of connections that she has. So again, she had that link to ODHIR, the white nationalist group in Iceland, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. She was also a featured speaker at one of the other soft power groups called Canadians for the Rule of Law. She has ties to the Gatestone Institute, which is south of the border, one of the most influential and dominant funders of the Islamophobia industry. Other groups like Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, as well as we saw in the image prior, Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy. So again, one of the bigger organizations, anti-Islamic organizations in the United States, as well as the group Muslims Facing Tomorrow, which is one of the Muslim dissident groups in Canada. So you can just see the constellation of connections that, you know, one person, one player within this industry has, and how they are networked in these ways. Another example of some of the transnational links that Canadian players have, as Barbara pointed out, in the introduction to my talk, the Islamophobia industries, in fact, does have global dimensions. And there are various players in Europe, excuse me, and elsewhere. And Canadians, like in this case, Lauren Southern, has links with both, as we see in the image here, Martin Sellner, who's the Austrian responsible for Generation Identity, the white nationalist organization, and the alt-right influencer, Brittany Pettibone. So this sort of trio was involved in a campaign, the Defend Europe campaign. And just to give you some context about that campaign, as we know, there are a number of migrants who are traveling from continental Africa, North Africa, and are crossing the sea and trying to, find safe haven in Europe. So a number of humanitarian groups like Doctors Without Borders sent out boats to try and, help people if they were in peril as they make that crossing on the sea, because many of them are in sort of rickety, rowboats and things like that. So they were out doing, these sort of humanitarian NGOs were out doing rescue and support campaigns for those migrants. So what this trio and Defend Europe did was buy this ship called the Sea Star. Lauren Southern was part of that mission. And they went out under the guise of saying, well, actually what's happening is human trafficking, so we're going to stop that. And we're going to go out and actually stop these human traffickers. But in fact, they were interfering with the work of these humanitarian NGOs. And so here's an example of the transnational ties and groups, between Canada, US, and Europe, and their involvement in this campaign, to this very xenophobic and Islamophobic campaign to, keep migrants out of Europe, what they would see as the invaders that were entering. So, we can see that there is a significant amount of money that's required to, mount these campaigns. And in the United States, there's been some excellent research done on the funding behind the Islamophobia industry, the donors who fund these campaigns. And so these reports were done by the Council of American Islamic Relations. And they identified, in a study by CARE, the Islamophobia industry has, there were about 74 groups that either foster or fund Islamophobia in the United States. And within those groups, 33 inner core groups had access to $204 million in total revenue. And then beyond that, there were outer core groups that were not explicitly designated for anti-Muslim advocacy, but their work regularly tends to include that. And in 2013 alone, the inner core groups had access to over $34 million in revenue. So these are very, very deep pockets through which Islamophobia is being bankrolled. Now, a report that came out, I think it was in 2018, Hijacked by Hate, that CARE did a deeper dive into some of the funding within the Islamophobia industry that was happening through philanthropic organizations in the United States. And that money was channeled through something called donor advised funds. And if you want all the details, please look at their report. It's really staggering. But what they determined was that there are about over 1,000 foundations in the United States that were channeling $1.5 billion into about 39 Islamophobia network groups. So that funding is, again, staggering. It shows the way that Islamophobia groups and organizations and individuals are able to bankroll the bigotry that they're involved in and sustain these campaigns. Now, we don't know, we can't actually track the money trail in Canada in the way that they can in the United States by using tax records. We don't have that same facility here in Canada. But we know that there are ties between Canadian players and some of these US-based donor organizations. So I'll just say a little bit about some of the organizations that we know have some Canadian connections. So the Gatestone Institute is one of the biggest funders of the Islamophobia industry in the United States. And the Gatestone was founded by Nina Rosenwald, who is heiress to the Sears Roebuck fortune, and has been dubbed the, quote, sugar mama of anti-Muslim hate in the United States. So she's used her wealth to forge alliances between the American pro-Israel lobby and the anti-Muslim networks. Now, as far as Canadian connections with Gatestone, we see Christine Douglas Williams, who I showed in the slide prior, Muslim dissidents like Rahil Raza and Salim Mansour were distinguished fellows with the Gatestone Institute. The next also very influential sort of think tank in the United States that is also a main donor of the industry is the Middle East Forum. And that was founded by Daniel Pipes, who is considered the godfather of the Islamophobia industry and is a key figure in the US Islamophobia industry. So some of the studies done in the US that looked at US tax records revealed that the Middle East Forum receives the majority of its funding from Gatestone, founder Nina Rosenwald's abstraction fund. So they have a number of offshoots through which they channel this money. And so what we can see is this close ideological alignment and economic exchange between these organizations strengthens their ties and provides the economic and political currency underwriting their Islamophobic missions. So again, because we don't have access to tracking the money trail, we can't be very specific about amounts that come into Canada. However, we do know that the Middle East Forum funded one of the soft power groups, the Canadians for the Rule of Law Conference in 2019. And some Muslim dissidents, for example, Tariq Fatah was a Robert and Avi Levine Writing Fellow with the Middle East Forum. So there are some Canadian connections there. Another group is the Clarion Project, again, US based, but was founded by a Canadian Israeli film producer, as a matter of fact, and they're a central group in the Islamophobia industry. And it operates as a nonprofit organization, most of them are, that educate the public about the dangers of radical Islam. And so, several years ago, Shore produced a couple of films that were very controversial and problematic. Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West was one of them, and The Third Jihad. They are very intimately connected with, through their advisory board, with anti-Muslim figures like Frank Gaffney and Daniel Pipes. And their Canadian connections primarily include a lot of the Muslim dissidents that are featured in this report, Rahil Raza, Tariq Fatah, Salim Mansour, and Tahir Gora. And finally, the Shillman Foundation was one of those, over 1,000 funders of 39 Islamophobia networks in the US that was documented in CARE's Hijacked by Hate report, and it is a major player within the Islamophobia industry. Their connection to Canada was that they funded the English Defence League leader and white nationalist Tommy Robinson, a very active anti-Muslim activist. They funded his internship at Rebel Media. So we see, again, the ways in which these connections are reaching across the border and are allowing for this industry to gather strength and coordinate their efforts. So I just want to point out now, just in conclusion, that, as much as I'm talking about a very specific kind of network that has, galvanized and coalesced around the promotion of anti-Muslim bigotry, hate, and propaganda, there needs to be an environment that, within which these kinds of ideas and movements can sort of gain some traction and popularity and so on. And so I wanted to just point out again, as part of this broader ecosystem, that while, some of these ideas that these groups are purveying are not simply, from the far right echo chamber, they are reflected more broadly in Canadian public opinion. And so in the report, we distilled all of the reports that in Canada from about 2004 to the present that are in some way examining Canadians' views about the Muslim presence in Canada. And so here are just a few of the findings. In 2017, Radio Canada poll found that nearly 1 out of 4 Canadians, or 23%, would favor a ban on Muslim immigration to Canada, and in Quebec, that support rose to 32%. So this was, in and around the time that Donald Trump had taken power and had instituted the Muslim ban south of the border, and this was a way of gauging what Canadians would think if a similar ban was in Canada. So I think that those results are quite disturbing. The same poll revealed that 51% in Canada, 57% in Quebec felt that the presence of Muslims in this country made them somewhat or very worried about security. So again, we can see that, that sort of sense of the moral panic and fear about the Muslim presence is quite palpable in Canadian society at large, not just in these sort of far-right echo chambers. We see it reflected in the polls around, Muslim women's, faith-based attire, banning the burqa and citizenship ceremonies was something that Stephen Harper tried to institute. Where in 2015, 68% of Canadians disagreed with allowing Muslim women to wear the niqab or burqa in citizenship ceremonies, where they would cover their face, which is, also ironic now when people are, covering their face for, as a PPE and as to be good pandemic citizens, but of course to cover your face as part of a religious fidelity, would make you an outlaw. 72% agreed that the burqa or niqab are symbols of oppression that are rooted in a culture that is anti-woman. So we see that gendered Islamophobia is also very much reflected in public opinion. And an earlier survey on Canadian attitudes towards religion and multiculturalism found that 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims, and 42% believe that, well, discrimination against them is actually their own fault, right? So it's a sort of blaming the victim mentality that we see a significant number of Canadians, exhibiting. And so there is also, in addition to, the Islamophobia industry, there's something that I've labeled in this report or discussed as a kind of liberal Islamophobia. And this is sort of the paradox where we see in Canada values of equity, diversity, and inclusion are espoused and celebrated. On the one hand, we have Islamic History Month and all this sort of very celebratory multiculturalism and the saris, samosas, and steel bands kind of approach. And at the same time, policies and practices are enacted that target Muslims as suspect and illiberal minorities. And that further authorizes and normalizes Islamophobia. And I would say, it does a greater job of normalizing Islamophobia in Canada. And so, this idea of liberal Islamophobia, this kind of, where Islamophilia meets Islamophobia, is something that transcends all political stripes, and because all political parties will espouse the values of multicultural diversity, equity, inclusion on the one hand, but then have failed to repeal racist and anti-Muslim policies on another. And of course, there's a large slate of those policies when we look at our security industrial complex, racial profiling, and so on. So I just wanted to leave with that notion of liberal Islamophobia so we don't forget that it isn't just in the far-right echo chambers. So this presentation has really just been the tip of the iceberg of unpacking the networks of bigotry and anti-Muslim hate and identifying how they bolster ideological and systemic forms of Islamophobia and create a breeding ground for the hate crimes. And it's imperative for fully understanding the dynamics of Islamophobia as a system of oppression and the industry behind its promotion. And it's through this kind of examination that we gain a more robust understanding of Islamophobia's ecosystem and then can begin to develop measures that address, the complex contemporary formations of Islamophobia. And just as the final slide, I think one of the sort of metaphors I've come to really envision this challenge of combating Islamophobia is that it's pretty much like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You know, as much as in this study we, and when I say we, I mean myself and a team of some graduate researchers who helped put together some of the facts and information on this report, we went down hundreds of rabbit holes investigating so many different Islamophobic groups and organizations and individuals, and one led to another. And so it was very much like this game of whack-a-mole. Even when we identify one, we find another one popping up over here. And so it seems like a never-ending challenge to combat Islamophobia on the multiple fronts within which anti-Muslim racism is being waged. And so, you know, it was very much a formidable challenge. So I thank you very much for listening to a presentation, and I am looking forward to any questions or comments. So I'll just put my camera back on. There we go. And maybe I should stop sharing. Great.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jasmin. I think that was, yeah, as you say, it's the tip of the iceberg and frightening as it stands. Yeah, so I thank you for taking us down that scary rabbit's hole, if you will. And I think that sort of one of the places you ended up was, you know, the significance of that normalization of Islamophobia, as we're seeing the normalization of hate more broadly, almost trickle down, right, from political narratives and from media narratives into public opinion, the way that it shapes and informs that. And I think one of the things that I was wondering as you were speaking, and because I know that you've been at this for a while for the report, and it started some time ago, but I wonder what you see as the implications or the consequences of the last couple of years in particular, where you know, there's been decided you know, sort of growth in anti-statism, anti-authority sentiments, and you know, other forms of, you know, far-right narratives are still there, but somehow almost playing second fiddle to the anti-state, you know, the anti-science narrative. So what have been the patterns over the last couple of years in Islamophobia? Is it more frightening for the fact that perhaps it is now at least off our radar? Not that it's gone away, but it's off our radar.
You know, I think when it comes to the particular groups that we looked at in the Islamophobia industry, I think they still very much are holding on to these narratives and continue to purvey them. I think what we're saying it now in the last couple of years, and with the kind of movements that far-right movements that have galvanized in Canada, particularly during the pandemic and around the so-called Freedom Convoy and so on, are different kinds of conspiracy theories that are being leveraged, that are anti-statist, anti-globalist. Already a lot of the conspiracy theories about Muslims, you know, bring Trudeau in as a figure, you know, whether he's considered a closet Muslim, whether he's, you know, somehow authorizing, you know, Muslims to sort of surreptitiously begin to infiltrate the government because of the number of, you know, Muslim MPs there are. And so that's often part of the narrative. And of course, you know, part of the also anti-statist, anti-government, you know, kinds of conspiracy theories. So the worlds now are colliding, I think, rather than one just simply overshadowing the others. I think they are tending to collide in particular ways where they can, you know, again, fortify and reinforce, you know, those messages, and actually extend the reach and influence of these, you know, actors. And so I think that that's a very disturbing development. And I think it's like, you know, the stone that turns and gathers moss, like we start to keep seeing the traction that is being you know, garnered by these various groups. And it'll be interesting to continue to look and see whether some of these newer groups are going to in any way align with. We already see some of the same players. For example, Thomas Quiggin was a very big player within the sort of, you know, Freedom Convoy. He's also one of the people we focused on in the report within the sort of think tanks and their designated security experts. And he's a huge proponent of the conspiracy theory that Muslim charities are fronts for groups like, you know, Islamist groups like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. And he has very clearly made those allegations against specific Muslim charities who are now actually suing him for defamation. So that is starting to happen as well. So we already see that sort of, migration of one of these key actors in the Islamophobia industry also now being part of some of these newer movements.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and I appreciate that. The chat was disabled, but lots of room for questions in the Q&A. So first one is, in my research, I focus on the effects of Bill 21 in Quebec and the oppressive nature of this law. Can you elaborate on the conceptual link between Islamophobia and oppression? Thank you.
So yeah, Bill 21, which is now Law 21. I was just in Quebec and actually got a nice button that said no Law 21, is again, one of those examples of liberal Islamophobia, of institutionalized Islamophobia, where Islamophobia becomes legislated. And, I think that the support of particular Islamophobia actors, and in this case, I would say the most influential would be the most sort of Muslim dissidents, the native informers who are actually supporting that, lends a lot of credence to the underlying rationale and racial logics of racialized secularism in Quebec. So they are actually, helping to promote some of the underlying, ideas behind that law, that, this is an an anti-woman expression, that this challenges secularism, and, all of the arguments that we know are used to justify this policy. And that to me is also part of what a lot of people would look at. Not everyone knows about the Islamophobia industry. Not everyone has access to the kinds of information that they are putting out there, although of course a lot of them are now very, they have lots of social media presence, and that's also how they monetize what they do. But more people would be aware of something like Bill 21, which then signals to the public that, well, there must be something to be feared here. Why does this containment need to happen? Why does this regulation and control of these people need to, happen? Bans against the niqab, to me, there's been, more than a decade of attempts to try and ban religious attire in Quebec. And I remember when, it was particularly to do with face veils, and there were only at that time, maybe 20 women in the entire province of Quebec, right, that were even wearing a niqab. So one has to question where that fear and moral panic is actually being directed, right? Is it just about, just these women who have chosen, a particular kind of religious expression? Of course not. It's deeper in terms of the way in which those symbols have become cultural signifiers of something that is far more seen as very detrimental to the very fabric of Canadian, and in this case, is part of the liberal Islamophobia landscape that is really important to, challenge and understand that when we have that, we also then allow for Islamophobia networks to actually, foment and find fodder for their campaigns.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, the next question, it's fairly long, so bear with me. Thank you for the very important work you're doing. I applaud it as well, including this informative report. The report rightly makes many references to the Conservative Party of Canada's discourses and practices. Could you touch on the place of the party in the Islamophobia industry, and whether you have seen any shifts over the course of the recent leadership campaigns and any changes? It seems they have now at least acknowledged Islamophobia after the London attack versus their response to the Motion 103, for example. And perhaps this is a result of activism from below as well, but would be interested to hear your reflections on this.
It's interesting that, thank you for that question and for the positive feedback. When we talk about Motion 103, I mean, it's very interesting. I talk about it in the report as really one of those flashpoints that galvanize many sectors of the Islamophobia industry. And, when you talk about the role of the Conservative government, we can look, for example, at the minority report that came out of the broader report on M103, which became the basis for Canada's now national anti-racism strategy. And I've been very critical about, I mean, I testified in those hearings. They were all across Canada. A number of people testified about Islamophobia and religious discrimination, systemic racism. But when the report came out, it actually very much sidelined Islamophobia, even though it was the catalyst for this study. You know, out of the some 30 recommendations, there were maybe 3 that related to Islamophobia. And so it was very much sidelined, and contained within the report is the conservative minority report. And they drew very heavily on, you know, Muslim dissidents, for example, to make their case and to express sentiments. So it was very evident in who they called also as witnesses in some of these proceedings. The particular view that they wanted to, or the voice, the particular voice they wanted to amplify. And so I think, you know, certainly conservative politicians like Stephen Harper had a strong role to play in fomenting Islamophobic moral panic. You know, his comments about, you know, what did he call it? Islamicism, which isn't even a word, by the way, but actually is like the greatest threat to Canada, and that they were, you know, Muslim radicals who were in their basements and in the mosques that were just radicalizing and fomenting, you know, future campaigns of homegrown, you know, violence and terror and so on. And, you know, that has a lot of impact. In fact, my I had a book also come out this year in addition to this report, which is Under Siege: Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And I looked at the impact of, you know, 9/11 and the global war on terror and domestic security policies and so on, and heightened Islamophobia in Canada, to see how it shaped, you know, the generation of Muslim youth that were growing up under the specter of all of these conditions, and how they navigated that. And so those ideas about Muslim youth as being, you know, potential radicals, terrorists, jihadists, and so on, is something that the millennial generation of Muslim youth really had to address in their day-to-day lives. It politicized them at a very young age. And they had to, you know, find ways to work against that stereotype because of this sort of collective labeling and burden of guilt and responsibility that was laid on them, right? And so, you know, that was one of the effects, where they were always trying to be that image corrective. They also became very, because they knew they were under surveillance, and that those the security industrial complex and those policies and practices of the state also came in under the conservative, you know, Harper government. They were being surveilled. They had security agencies coming out, you know, knocking on their doors and showing up at the universities, you know, their Muslim student associations and things like that. And that also created in them a sense of becoming very self-surveilling and monitoring themselves and trying not to be suspicious. You know, and that is something that, you know, when we talk about Islamophobia and its impact, you know, in my book, I talk about the need to really also look at the affective registers of Islamophobia and how it is having an impact on how, you know, Muslims navigate their lives and experiences. So there's definitely a connection between all of these things, right, in terms of how that political rhetoric is a dog whistle on the one hand, but also then begins to shape policies, practices, institutions in society that then also impact how young Muslims grow up and have to navigate that world. And Muslim communities at large have to also learn to navigate the way in which their identities are being collectively labeled and maligned.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So here's an interesting question. What can you tell us about what these disparate groups gain from being Islamophobic and promoting this form of hate?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in a lot of cases, and it depends on groups. I think that being part of the reason that they join, you know, or become part of these groups, you know, usually they have some sort of a kind of ideological, political goal that they want to achieve through these networks. And so part of it is to further particular campaigns, you know, particularly among the pro-Israel fringe right groups, and been very, very careful in this report to take note of the fact that the groups we do talk about are considered, you know, right and fringe within, the broader Jewish groups that exist, and not to try and essentialize or in any way, give out any other idea, and to make sure that, we're not promoting anti-Semitism as a byproduct of this. We're very, very clear in the report in identifying that these are very specific groups, and drawing on the research of a number of other Jewish organizations that have actually called these groups into account. But for example, their main goal seems to be protecting Israel from any criticism. And so that is, I think, the primary focus of those groups. For other groups like Muslim dissidents, who would work with a lot of these groups, it is a kind of, professional Islamophobia and a certain kind of careerism, I think, that comes out of this. So you not only get your 15 minutes of fame within, they're all writing books that are self-published. They're trying to promote those. They're also, have their social media platforms where, a lot of the influencers, they get a lot of followers, they have their swag that they want to sell, so there's different ways in which this becomes profitable, both in terms of, creating a certain name and cachet for yourself, becoming recognized within these spheres of influence, and in some ways also monetizing and professionalizing Islamophobia. And so I think that those sort of ideological, political, and kind of careerist aims, if you will, come together in terms of being some of the motivators for the individuals and groups involved.
Thank you. So the next question, as PhD students in education researching Islamophobia in education, what are some resources you would suggest to start to dive deeper into the issue? The research interest is the intersection of Muslim youth at risk, justice, and Islamophobia. What are some other issues, fields that require further research in Islamophobia in education?
That's a good question. That's kind of where I started. My career was looking at education and Islamophobia in that context. And, I know of a number of other students who are working on these kinds of questions. Islamophobia is so broad, and, it infiltrates so many different sectors that there's no shortage of work that needs to be done. So education is definitely an important place to look, not only as a site where Islamophobia can be reproduced and purveyed, but also as an avenue to begin to challenge Islamophobia. And so I think, concentrating too on how do we combat this, and using education as a way to do that, I think is important. In my book on Under Siege, Islamophobia in the 9/11 generation, my final chapter actually looked at youth who are using the arts as a form of public pedagogy and a kind of anti-colonial pedagogy as a way of, taking back the mic and representing themselves, and using different modalities of the arts to do that, whether through spoken word poetry, whether through film, comedy, a variety of, theater, a variety of different means that they could begin to purvey a different story or different narrative, and actually begin to have discursive control over how they were being represented, right? So that, I talked about as a Muslim counter public space, I think is very, very important. And it's kind of where, in doing a lot of this work, it's kind of a lot of, very depressing and very formidable challenges we're seeing. So it was very heartening to see a lot of youth engaging in the arts as a form of resistance, and as a way of using cultural production to tell alternative stories, and then, imagine alternative futures. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think you're right. Even in some of the work that I've done as well, I mean, that the resiliency and the resistance becomes so clear. I remember one young Muslim woman saying, who had never covered before, in the context, I think that was of Harper's, going on and on. Harper's rhetoric said, it's kind of like, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. So started covering for that reason, right? As a form of resistance and pushback. So yeah,
absolutely.
Forms, yeah, so important. Okay, next question. Could you please comment on the intersection between Islamophobia and other forms of exclusionary discourse, particularly anti-immigration and anti-refugee rhetoric? It seems that your mapping is a significant guide to these industries as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. Absolutely. I mean, I think, these, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism is, also draws upon anti-immigrant narratives, xenophobic ideologies, gendered forms of Islamophobia. So the intersectionality of different forms of hate and bias and, narratives come together, right, in the promotion of Islamophobia. So, for example, a lot of the conspiracy theories, rely on this idea, as we saw, of the Muslim invader, the Trojan horse coming in, this sort of, taking over by stealth. But it all refers to, immigrants and refugees who are interlopers in Canadian society and who are coming here and, seeking to undermine Western value, Western civilization, and everybody's, way of life. Those kinds of tropes, are very much attached to, Muslim bodies in particular, but Muslim immigrants, refugees who are coming, from, other parts of the world that have to then, be labeled in that particular way. I mean, honestly, if we look back to the Quebec mosque shooting, when you looked at Bissonnette's, part of his rationale for why he chose to do that had to do with the fact that Trudeau had made a statement, a tweet or something that was about Syrian refugees and supporting them. And he, saw this as a existential threat to, a sort of a white genocide type of call or that Trudeau was making, and so felt that he needed to take up arms in the midst of that. So we can see how the fear of the dangerous foreigner, particularly the Muslim foreigner coming in, is part of that threat. We also see through demographic replacement, the kind of biopolitics of fear being enacted against particularly Muslim women figure in that, as, sort of their reproductive power becomes a demographic threat. Their veiled bodies become a civilizational and cultural threat. And so there's many ways that different kinds of, racial logics and ideologies converge, with Islamophobia. And as part of this wider, kind of landscape and ecosystem.
Yeah, if we think back to, after the U.S. election as well, when there were migrants coming, irregular migrants coming up from the U.S., and that fear was not just that it was an immigrant invasion, but that it was a Muslim invasion, when in fact, most of them were, most of them were Latino.
Right.
So, yeah, but it characterized as this part of that broader invasion.
That's right.
Okay, looks like the last question here, and it's a long one, as Tanners are. So you might want to take notes on the question. So thank you so much for your presentation, Jasmin, and congratulations on the new book. Could you say a little bit more about the historical formation of liberal Islamophobia in Canada? Was the first 8 to 12 years of the US-led global war on terror and Canadian foreign policy, national security's general commitment to that project the incubator of liberal Islamophobia in Canada, or does it have a much longer history? Did Canada import components of its liberal Islamophobia from the Bush presidency and surrounding Islamophobia industry? Relatedly, what is the relationship between the contemporary Canadian far right's Islamophobia, its racist narratives and tropes, and the liberal Islamophobia that were designed, mobilized by government institutions, political parties, and news media outlets in support of the global war on terror? What are the similarities and differences between far right Islamophobia and liberal Islamophobia with regard to narratives, tropes, themes, etc.? So some of answer the bits that you like.
Hey, thank you, Tanner. That's a wonderful set of questions. I think as far as the historical formations of liberal Islamophobia, I mean, Islamophobia in general, has a long history and genealogy, right? So we can trace it back to early, Muslim communities, including the Prophet himself, who were persecuted for their beliefs. And, Islamophobia extends and takes on different inflections historically as we start to map its trajectory through the Middle Ages and then into the modern period through colonialism, and then into when we start to look at its expansion into other localities. And so when we talk about Canada, I mean, my work has, my book looked at the 9/11 generation. So I was predominantly at that time looking at that post 9/11 iteration of Islamophobia and how that took shape. So I'll speak more about that. Although, as we know, I'm talking about liberal Islamophobia as being this paradox where you have multiculturalism and celebratory multiculturalism and sorry, samosa steel bands, and you have, Islamic History Month and so on. And at the same time, you've got these very draconian security policies that are targeting Muslims. You've got things like Bill 21 in play. You've got passenger protect programs and no-fly lists, right? So the flying while Muslim is happening. Even Muslim toddlers have their names on this list. So these two things coexist. And that creates this paradox that I talk about as a kind of where Islamophilia meets Islamophobia, right? And that's what I'm trying to talk about with liberal Islamophobia. So in that sense, it's guised in a lot more polite sorts of rhetoric on the one hand, or even celebratory rhetoric. But what that is obscuring is, the types of, policies like security certificates and the Anti-Terrorism Act and all the whole slate of security policies that were ushered in the same post 9/11, state of exception period. And so in a way, the multiculturalism became a kind of cover, for those policies and practices to take place, without a lot of scrutiny, right? And allowed the state of a space of innocence so that they could say, but look, we brought in Islamic History Month, or, we're doing all of these things to support Muslim populations and so on. And so I think that that's, important to kind of interrogate and think about, because the post 9/11 era ushered in this time where a lot of these policies then became seen as reasonable and just and necessary to really to focus and hone in on securitizing Muslim populations and so on. So it allowed that state of exception to expand. And that's where we start to see that sort of Muslim folk devil narrative and the moral panics around Muslims, really start to gain traction at that time. Again, at the same time as we have that celebratory multiculturalism, in play. As far as the connection between liberal Islamophobia and the far right, I mean, I think liberal forms of Islamophobia, again, that is like legislated forms of Islamophobia, policies, practices that alert the population at large that, okay, this is a community we need to contain, surveil, perhaps exile, right? And that to me has a lot more impact than just the conspiracy theories and, echo chamber of the far right, because it does a lot of the work of normalizing Islamophobia, and because it's coming from spaces of authority. And, the idea that it's a benevolent state that wants to protect people. So we need to actually keep a special eye on these groups and so on. So I think that does a lot in terms of giving, average folks the messaging about Muslims as a problem. In my book, I talk about Muslims, responding to W.E.B. Du Bois's question in The Souls of Black Folk. What does it feel like to be a problem? And that is kind of what Muslim youth are grappling with, because they were that generation that were very much constituted as being a problem. And so when we then look at, okay, well, what are the far right and all of those players, what do they contribute to this? I think the synergy between liberal Islamophobia and far right groups and narratives is, again, that is the liberal Islamophobia provides, primes the ground for these groups and their messaging to gain traction, because whatever they're saying, they can also point to the fact, well, look, we have these security policies, so they must be dangerous foreigners, right? It is a way of validating and justifying to some extent the propaganda that they are purveying, and the hate that they are trying to foment. The anti-Muslim racism finds a certain justification through these policies and practices. So I think that is the kind of synergy between the liberal Islamophobia and the far right Islamophobia.
Yeah, and that sort of makes me think about when we think about the summit on Islamophobia, was it last summer, a year ago?
Yes.
And then, the notion that there will be a special envoy on Islamophobia, although that, no one's been named yet. Are those performative actions? Well, is there sort of a true commitment shining through in there at all?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Barbara, because, I was a speaker at the summit. I was kind of, and by the way, they held the summit during Muslim holidays of Eid. So, and it was done very quickly.
Mhm.
There were kind of two summits back to back, the anti-Semitism, the Islamophobia. It did feel to me like an exercise of checking off a particular box.
Mm.
One of the reasons I did not add any recommendations on my report on the Islamophobia industry was the fact that during that summit, I mean, Muslims, individuals, groups across the country put forward hundreds of recommendations to the government about challenging and tackling Islamophobia. So I didn't really feel that I needed to add any more. The question becomes, are they going to be actionable? Yes, there's to be a special envoy. I think that announcement will probably come soon. Are these performative? I think that I feel like a lot of it is until I start to see more, real action. It took 4 years for there to be a National Day of Remembrance after the Quebec mosque shooting. Again, the hearings on motion 103 completely sidelined Islamophobia. We had 3 out of 30 recommendations. So this is something that I'm seeing consistently in terms of the way Islamophobia is really a global phenomenon. In Canada, it has reached deadly proportions. Am I seeing a response proportional to that threat? I don't think so. So, I mean, I'm just, kind of hardwired to be cynical about these things because of where I sit and what I do. I'm, glad to see that there is more emphasis that security communities are placing on white nationalist groups and so on in terms of identifying, and the important work that you're doing, Barbara, I think is very critical. And there needs to be more support. We haven't seen, for example, for those of us in academia, we haven't seen, SHRC put out any particular, calls for making this a priority area, or, chairs or centers or anything, like that would allow more of a high level, approach to addressing Islamophobia, informing policy, and so on. So I don't know as yet what to expect, but I think we need to keep the state accountable, and by continuing to, be critical of what's happening, and demanding that more is done, and so on. So I think that advocacy is important. Muslim lobby groups are going to be needed more so to be able to make sure that these issues stay on the radar and they don't shift and are pushed to the side. So I think that's something that's missing. Really is the social movement behind Islamophobia. We've seen so many issues that became elevated, rightly so, through social movements like Black Lives Matter, or movements like Idle No More, and so on, but we've never really had that same sort of galvanizing of social movements and solidarity around Islamophobia. So I think that's something that's missing and important to maintain accountability around addressing and combating Islamophobia.
Thank you. Well, I think those questions will be raised at the event that the last question suggests here. So this is a much more practical question. What are some of the topics that will be covered at the IISRA conference on Islamophobia in May in Berkeley? Can you please recommend topics that are accepted for those writing abstracts for that conference? Thank you.
Oh, our forthcoming conference at Berkeley. So the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, we just recently formed as an academic association. And so we had our inaugural conference in Istanbul in July of this year. Our next conference is going to be at University of California, Berkeley. And by the way, the Islamophobia Studies Center and the Islamophobia Research and Development Project were my partners on the Islamophobia Industry project. So our conference will be at Berkeley this year, and it replaces the annual Islamophobia conference that was happening for the last decade. It'll now be the ISRA conference. The call is very open. We didn't have a particular theme per se. I think the sort of general theme was about knowledge production around Islamophobia. So people are invited to, submit abstracts, based on the work they're doing, the research or empirical research that they're doing. And, we will put together panels to reflect those various interests, but it's not, contained in a particular theme. So we're sort of keeping them more open-ended because, Islamophobia studies is very broad. People are working on it in very interdisciplinary ways. And so we didn't want to confine the scope by having a kind of theme that would only allow certain kinds of scholarship to the exclusion of others. So please do send in your abstract, and they will be viewed by a committee, and we'll go from there. So we will be having an annual conference every year. We see ourselves as a kind of global caravan, and we kind of go from the global south and the global north back and forth. So next year, I'm not sure where we'll be, but we will be in Berkeley in May. So look forward to anyone who wants to join us.
And what a great platform for exactly these sorts of conversations that we need to unpack. Brad had just sent me an email saying, finally somebody's talking about, the links between, Rebel News, for example, and the broader industry. So yeah, thank you for raising these concerns in the Canadian context, because we've been, I think, far too complacent in this space. So thank you again for the work, and thank you for taking the time to join us today, Jasmin. I think it was an incredible conversation, as we can tell, I think, by the number and the quality of the questions that the participants or the attendees also thoroughly enjoyed themselves. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the next project.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everyone for your amazing questions and engagement. I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share this work.
Yeah, great. And thank you to the attendees as well. Hope to see you again at some of our future events. So everyone take care, and happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays, everyone. Bye-bye.